Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. It's the first Monday after a general election weekend, so we got lots coming up for you. And I'm joined by Crystal. Crystal, welcome to Novara Live. A pleasure to have you on the show.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me.
It is a real pleasure. You're a drag artist. You successfully sued Lawrence Fox for defamation. We did cover that on this show, so congratulations for that. Coming up later tonight, we'll look at how the Tory general election campaign has faced a disastrous start. The co-founder of Human Rights Watch has declared that Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza. And we look at the plan announced by Rishi Sunak to revive national service. Stay tuned for all of that. Let's go to our first story, though. And before we get going, a warning: it does contain footage that some may find disturbing. Israel has attacked displaced Palestinians in Gaza's southern city of Rafah, killing at least 45 people and injuring dozens more. The airstrike came in the middle of the night, setting ablaze a tent encampment in the northwest of the city. Displaced Palestinians from all over Gaza were sleeping when the bombs hit, with children and women amongst the dead. The scenes from Rafah are amongst the most horrific we've so far seen in this war, with burned and mutilated bodies being dragged out of the flames. One resident being treated at Rafah's Kuwaiti hospital said this: "The airstrikes burnt the tents are melting, and people's bodies are also melting." Some of the footage from the assault is too graphic to show here. In one video, a man at the scene holds up the body of a small child who has been decapitated in the strike. A separate image shows the burned body of a baby. As has so often been the case during Israel's assault on Gaza, children appear to have been particularly hard hit. That's because the tents hit were largely housing families after the IDF declared the area a humanitarian zone. And it appears that no evacuation orders had been issued. The attack comes in the wake of a ruling issued by the ICJ on Friday, ordering Israel to halt its offensive in Rafah. Israel rejected that order, arguing that the offensive was in line with international law. Over the 48 hours following the ICJ order, Israel conducted over 60 air raids on Rafah. That's according to Euromed Monitor. But Hamas did strike back for the first time in 4 months. The armed group launched a barrage of missiles at Tel Aviv. Most of the 8 rockets fired were knocked out by Israel's Iron Dome defense system, and there were no reports of injuries. In fact, the only damage that the rockets appear to have done was to dislodge some roof tiles. The scenes in Rafah, of course, were very different. Israel's attack on the camp certainly appears retaliatory, though Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described it as, quote, a tragic mistake. The IDF has also denied the bombing was deliberate, instead saying this: an IDF aircraft struck a Hamas compound in Rafah in which significant Hamas terrorists were operating a short while ago. The strike was carried out against legitimate targets under international law through the use of precise munitions and on the basis of precise intelligence that indicated Hamas's use of the area. The IDF is aware of reports indicating that as a result of the strike and fire that was ignited, several civilians in the area were harmed. The incident is under review. While 2 Hamas leaders were reportedly killed in the attack, precise munitions don't usually end up burning civilians alive in tents. And the scenes of devastation lend credence to the idea that they involved heavy explosives. Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hassam Zomlot, said this: Israel commits a massacre in Rafah this evening, dropping several 2,000-pound bombs on civilian tents and UN compounds, murdering dozens of civilians seeking shelter. This was Israel's response to the ICJ ruling Friday that it must halt its offensive on Gaza. Earlier this month, the US paused a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, fearing they would be used to attack civilians in Rafah. And Hamas has implicated the US in Israel's attack, with a senior Hamas official calling the attack, quote, a massacre, and holding the United States responsible for aiding Israel with weapons and money. The United States had previously said it would tolerate Israel's so-called limited operation in eastern Rafah, but was warned against, or it did warn, a full-on assault on the city. But this attack took place in the west of Rafah, far from the demarcated zone of the limited operation. And with displaced civilians killed en masse, Israel's attack on Rafah has been met with global condemnation. French President Emmanuel Macron said this, outraged by the Israeli strikes that have killed many displaced persons in Rafah. These operations must stop. There are no safe areas in Rafah for Palestinian civilians. I call for full respect for international law and an immediate ceasefire. Ireland's Foreign Minister, Micheál Martin, is meeting with other EU foreign ministers in Brussels. He said this about the attack on Rafah.
I condemn the violence of yesterday, the rockets that were struck at Tel Aviv, and the heinous attack on the Rafah tent refugee camp last evening, where again innocent children and civilians were killed, again in violation of the International Court of Justice and its instructions to Israel to cease the bombardment of Rafah.
Other European countries to have condemned the attacks include Italy, Spain, and Norway. In the Arab world, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Jordan have all criticised Israel, with many calling on the international community to enforce the ICJ's order. But the player that really matters has been much weaker. The US government hasn't yet given an official line, but Barak Ravid of Axios reports this. White House National Security Council spokesperson tells me the devastating images following the IDF strike in Rafah last night that killed dozens of innocent Palestinians are heartbreaking. Israel has a right to go after Hamas, but as we've been clear, Israel must take every precaution possible to protect civilians. We are actively engaging the IDF and partners on the ground to assess what happened. So pretty wishy-washy there. Rishi Sunak also hasn't said much of consequence, but Labour leader Keir Starmer was asked about the attack at a press conference this morning.
As UK Prime Minister, what would you be saying right now to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Stop. Those scenes, those reports are horrifying. And, what makes it worse is that this was a safe zone with women and children in it and families that already fled a number of times. It is horrifying to see that. I've been saying for some time that the Rafah offensive should not take place. And what you saw there was the consequences, the inevitable consequences of that offensive.
There's something frustrating there, both about the question and the answer. The question, what would you say about the attack on Rafah? Now, I'm not particularly interested in what Keir Starmer would say about anything, right? What matters is what he would do. Would he impose consequences on Israel for this kind of massacre? Would you impose sanctions? Would you stop selling them weapons? Would you not just abstain at the Security Council, as the UK so often does, but actually actively vote to hold Israel accountable? I want to know what he would do. So to me, that's the question that journalists should be asking. Of course, that's not an excuse for Keir Starmer. He's asked, what would I say? He could say, well, I won't just say this is wrong. I will act on it as well. He doesn't, because he doesn't want to commit to acting. Israel's top military prosecutor has called the attack, quote, very grave, and has promised a full investigation. We can't exactly be confident that that will be a fair and thorough one. I'm joined now by Daniel Levy, a British-Israeli analyst who was part of Israel's negotiating team during the Oslo process. Thank you so much for joining us again. To start off, what exactly do we know now about what happened in Rafah last night?
Well, we know what we've seen, and we know who conducts those attacks, which military. I don't think there's any question that this isn't one of those incidents where they're trying to claim, perhaps they will, I haven't heard that yet, I don't expect it to have any credibility if that is the claim, that this might not be Israeli ordnance. I think it's quite clear who caused this, where it took place, what the toll is, although that toll, unfortunately, is likely to go up. The images are beyond. And we know, crucially, that this is in the area people had been told to go to. So you've had this kind of pretense, this make-believe that, well, the Israelis have managed to get most of the civilians out of Rafah, and the very light pink line that the American president drew was perhaps being respected because so many of the civilians had gone out of the areas where Israel is operating. Well, that was always for the birds. But now we have seen what is happening, that there are no safe zones. People were being sent to areas where their basic provisions and needs could not be met, more suffering. And on top of it, we then see this.
This happened, 48 hours after the International Court of Justice ruled that Israel should halt its offensive in Rafah. Now, as we discussed sort of last week with an expert on international law, there are sort of some ambiguities about the actual implications of that ruling. But this seems I mean, is provocative the right word? It seems to do something this, well, murderous is what it looks like to most people in the world, 48 hours after the world court has told you not to do anything in that region. I mean, how should we understand this happening 48 hours after that?
We don't have to even go to that place, Michael. This is what has been going on. This is a particularly horrendous manifestation. This is day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, 8 months it's coming up on now. And Israel has consistently tested, can we get away with this? And it has consistently been sent the message after the first International Court of Justice provisional measures ruling, after the International Criminal Court issuing of the arrest warrants, after the US administration apparently drew a red line on Rafah. Every time Israel has tested, I'm not saying by intentionally conducting a strike like this, but by continuing. Really, Israel didn't have to change its modus operandi. I think that's the crucial thing for this to happen. This is exactly what has been done until now. Now we're hearing a slightly different thing, which is we're going to investigate it ourselves, because one of the arguments against the ICC ruling is this issue of complementarity. That is not serious. This is Israel being able to continue to get away with this because, very simply, the court cannot operationalize its judgment. It can only be enforced if those who, in particular, are Israel's allies and on whom Israel depends call a stop to this. And calling a stop to this is not expressions of outrage. Do you have weapons trade with Israel? What is your position on Israeli participation at the Olympics in a few weeks' time? Is that okay when they're in violation of the ICJ and when there are arrest warrants from the ICC and when we see these images? Will your trade continue as usual? And if the answers to all of those things are business as usual, then please save your expressions of outrage because they have zero practical consequence.
In terms of the language used, we are seeing sort of a significant degree of divergence now between European leaders, notwithstanding Rishi Sunak, but say Macron and the German government and other European leaders. They are speaking now in a slightly more sort of severe and critical way about Israel than they had been. And that sort of puts them at a distance to the United States. But would you say that that is just words, or are we seeing anything from the likes of Macron which is putting material pressure on the Israelis?
I'm not seeing it. Talk is cheap. So I want to do two things. I want to acknowledge that the fact that they feel that they have to say these things is a consequence both of these shocking images and of the fact that the cost to those in the West who are trying to pass the laugh test when they talk about international legality, the international institutional architecture for carrying forward international law, norms, rule of law, they're trying to not sound totally ridiculous and naked in the town square when they say those things. The fact that they have to do that, that the cost of running cover for Israel has gone exponentially through the roof. The fact that they're having to do that also in the face of public mobilization across so much of the world, across so many spaces of those countries that are allied to and providing cover for Israel, that is all significant. What it tells me, though, is we are nowhere near a tipping point, and that mobilization has to keep going and redouble and try to get there when you have American presidential elections, other elections. People need to feel under pressure. They perhaps now feel under greater legal pressure as well. But we are not there because the Israeli prime minister, the Israeli foreign minister, the Israeli government can still turn around and make outrageous, spurious accusations. The foreign minister has said, this isn't the era of the Inquisitions anymore, Spain, because Spain was one of the countries that recognized Palestine. Or called the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, called the ICC chief prosecutor when he called for those arrest warrants to be issued. He said, you joined the gallery of anti-Semites and the judges in Germany. They should actually be put in their place. Also, this abuse and misuse of anti-Semitism should be put in its place. So there's a heck of a lot more that needs to be done. And to go to your point about, are we seeing greater American isolation? I hope that begins to penetrate, because the more that is the case, the more one at least has to hold out some kind of prospect that Biden at some stage will consider the cost to be greater than the benefit of his enabling of the images that we saw last night. And we haven't reached that, but you never know where that tipping point is. So keep pushing.
You mentioned there the American presidential elections. Now, obviously, that's going to be the most important election when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. We are in this country, though, currently in a general election. Have you heard anything from any of the candidates? I mean, do you think there is any sense in which this general election could matter for what's going on in Palestine?
Yeah, I don't want to rule that out. I do want to see Labour feeling that it needs to be in a position where, you said correctly that the question the journalist asked was completely wrongly framed in the first place. And media culpability is a whole different story in the West, also in Israel, by the way. But let's park that for a moment. But I would like to see us in a place where Labour does feel that it needs to get on the correct side of this, that it needs to follow through on what was a correct response to the ICC position by Shadow Foreign Secretary Lamy, and to act on that, and to actually finally make public what is the legal advice that has been received on weapons transfers. What is the position going to be on these things? Because, look, I've not been following, to be perfectly frank with you, I've not been following kind of blow by blow what's been said in the last hour and the last days. This has consumed me. But there is such a gulf between where most of the public is, certainly where most of the Labour voting public is, and where the political positions are. And to the extent to which the fact that this election is happening now, to the extent to which that can be narrowed and closed and translate into policy, has to be an opportunity. Look, other things have happened as a consequence of calling the election. So the appalling anti-boycott legislation, economic arrangements bill that the Sunak Tory government was pushing through, that's fallen by the wayside because they've run out of time. So we've got some good news on that. And now we have to translate that, because Biden doesn't operate in a vacuum. The Americans don't operate in a vacuum, and the Israelis don't operate in a vacuum. And that's where all of this ultimately matters.
On to, I suppose, a different but related topic. There's been reports today that Israel and Egyptian soldiers have exchanged fire at the Rafah crossing, or the Rafah border. An Egyptian soldier killed. As far as I understand, we don't know much more than that. But I mean, what would be going on there? Why would the Israelis and the Egyptians be shooting at each other on the Rafah border, and what diplomatic consequences could that have?
Look, so you're right, Michael. We don't yet have all the details of that. I don't know, if and when we'll get a full accounting of what has gone on. Israel has obviously a long-standing peace agreement with Egypt. Egypt has been part of the mediation. We haven't mentioned the hostages, but today the Israeli Prime Minister spoke in the Israeli Parliament, and you had families of the hostages holding up the pictures, because increasingly those families are convinced that he doesn't give a damn, that this is way down his order of priority. So Egypt's been part of that mediation. Egypt has primarily been nervous that this spills over into Egypt. We know that earlier on in Israel's assault on Gaza, there was talk of forcibly displacing the Palestinian population into Egypt. There were papers written in Israeli governmental ministries around this attempt at ethnic cleansing. Apparently, it was floated by the Americans with the Egyptians. I don't think that idea is entirely off the table. You have Israeli cabinet ministers who openly say that their goal is to depopulate, a second Nakba, depopulate Gaza of Palestinians and resettle Gaza. The Prime Minister has said, well, I just want to permanently reoccupy Gaza. So, somehow the moderate in that equation, I say with irony. So the Israeli-Egyptian relationship here has taken a downturn, I've got to be blunt here, not necessarily because of what Israel has done to the Palestinians. We have not seen Arab states significantly downgrading or cutting or reevaluating, those that have ties with Israel, reevaluating and repositioning those ties. That's a whole different area we can maybe talk about one day. But when Israel took over the Rafah border crossing, which is the crossing from Egypt into Gaza, it interposed itself between Rafah and the Egyptian side. So nothing could come in anymore directly from Egypt into Gaza. And that was the major access point because Israel had closed so many of the other land crossing, hence the dangerous, totally insufficient nonsense of an American-built seaport and of airdrops. That raised significantly the tensions. And one possibility of what happened is after last night, an Egyptian soldier on the border, familiar with what was going on, may have lost it. I think that might end up being what has gone on. And that speaks to the fact that while some of the Arab leaders may be trying to damp down and just manage this without changing policy, the sentiment, not just here and in other places, but of course also in that neighborhood, in the so-called Arab street, who are also, of course, exposed to these images, that sentiment is viscerally furious about what is going on and about the positions of their own governments. And that means this is increasingly difficult to manage, whether that's in Jordan, whether that's in Egypt, whether that's elsewhere. And we don't know, but I think whatever happened, Israel and Egypt will continue to try to manage this. And I don't think it's going to change that equation too much.
20 points behind in the polls, and after a bruising first 3 days of the general election campaign, Rishi Sunak came up with this idea to help turn things around.
We have so much to be proud of in Britain, but one of the problems in our society is that we have generations of young people who don't have the opportunities they deserve. Britain today faces a future that is more dangerous and more divided. There's no doubt our democratic values are under threat. That is why we will introduce a bold new model of national service for 18-year-olds, to be spent either in a competitive full-time military commission over 12 months, or with 1 weekend per month volunteering in roles within the community, like delivering prescriptions and food to infirm people, or in search and rescue.
Critics of the National Service Plan have suggested it's just a poorly planned last-minute ploy to win votes from the elderly. They tend to respond positively to the idea of national service in polls. But speaking to the BBC, James Cleverly said there was more to the plan than political opportunism.
It's about addressing the fragmentation that we've seen in society. Too many young people living in their own bubble, whether it be a digital bubble or a social bubble. And we want to get back to the situation where people are mixing with young people from different areas, different economic groups, different religions, to try and find a way of addressing the kind of fragmentation that we see too much.
Sounds a bit like sort of social engineering. I mean, if the many thousands of teenagers don't want to go into the army, you've only got 30,000 places for people to go into the military. So the majority of them would take the other option. But what kinds of things would they have to do? Well,
it could be a range of things. It could be a kind of a uniform public service, whether it be something like a special constable or on-call firefighter or emergency health responder or environmental protection, flood defence work. So we're looking to keep this open because the important bit is about that societal coming together. That's absolutely key. And we are investing in these young people. We have allocated 2.5 billion towards this. It's fully funded. We've, of course, discussed with senior military leaders about the military element of it, and that will be slightly different. So it will be a year if you choose the military bit. It will be 25 days if you choose the more civil option.
Now, I have to say, I wasn't quite as outraged as many people about this policy. And as I saw sort of on Twitter, I did 50 hours of community service when I was 19, albeit for blocking a runway. I was more radical back then. And I didn't mind it, right? I can see the logic of getting people from different backgrounds together to do community work. But this clearly was a bodged-together last-minute plan from a desperate government up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. How would the police or fire brigade make use of a teenager volunteering one weekend a month? I can't really see how that's going to be helpful. The government also haven't addressed what it would mean for young people that already work on the weekends. Would they lose out on much needed income, right? If you've got people who're studying in the week, working on the weekend, then saying you've got to go and volunteer for one weekend a month, I mean, it's impractical. It's also a little bit offensive. And above all, the idea that the Tories care about young people's social welfare and integration isn't borne out by their record. When the Tories entered government in 2010, £1.3 billion was spent annually on youth services. By 2019, the figure had fallen to £400 million, a 70% decrease. On LBC, Lewis Goodall asked James cleverly the obvious question.
Can you understand that if you're a young person, you might be forgiven for thinking that the Conservative Party doesn't like me very much? You triple their tuition. You triple their, well, let me finish. You triple their tuition fees. You took their right to go and work and study in Europe without impediment away. You didn't fund their education pandemic recovery plan properly because your Prime Minister, when he was Chancellor, said you didn't want to find the money. But now you have found the money to make them go and do something when they're fully grown adults at the weekends, or to make them join the military.
The Conservative Party has always been a party that's had a plan for the long term of the country. We are investing in young people. We are trying to address some of the challenges, some of the difficulties that young people face. I speak to young people a lot, always have done. My first role in politics was on youth policy at City Hall in London. And when you've heard people say, when I was in London, I heard people say they didn't mix with kids from the next door postcode. You can do one of two things. You can have
pensioners don't do that, Home Secretary. Pensioners don't mix with people from the next door postcode. It doesn't mean you're forcing them to go and mix with people.
You can. If you're asking me questions,
I am. But I'm just trying to explore the logic of it, Home Secretary. I'm just wondering why it's young people specifically at the sharp edge.
This is something where we're investing in young people. We do that all the time.
No, they don't. Right? As you've just seen, the Tories cut funding for youth services by 70%, have only now found some money when they found a policy that might appeal to pensioners. Right? We invest in young people all the time. What a ridiculous thing for a Tory politician to say. The one thing Cleverly has repeatedly pointed out is that reintroducing national service wouldn't make Britain exceptional. And that's true. In Switzerland, they have mandatory military service for all men aged between 18 and 25. Now, the sort of initial training here lasts 18 weeks, and then you have to take a series of refresher courses every year. You can opt out and do civilian activities if you're a conscientious objector, but you have to work 50% more hours if you don't want to do the military version. Now, in Switzerland, you can get out of this. You can avoid doing anything if you're too unfit. But you have to pay 3% extra income tax until you're 37 if you take that option. It does seem a bit harsh. You do get an opt-out if you have a disability. Now, that does sound pretty authoritarian to me. The scheme, though, is very popular. In 2013, Switzerland held a referendum to abolish national service. 73% voted no. Denmark also has mandatory military service, though you only have to do it if you're drawn in a lottery. And most of the slots are taken up by people who volunteer. So lots of people are willing to take part in the Danish military service. Sweden also has a lottery system. You have about a 4% chance of being conscripted. Conscientious objectors in Sweden have the right to choose an alternative service, so something a bit more like a citizen service. People who fail to take part when their number is drawn can face a fine or even prison. So military service isn't a completely alien concept, but the Tories talk less about what Sweden and Norway also offer their young people, namely a university education which is completely free and grants to cover their living expenses while studying. So when they say, with rights must come responsibilities, well, if you're going to give British young people the responsibility of some kind of national service, citizen or otherwise, maybe they should get some rights, free education, grants, housing, which isn't so expensive that they can't live in major cities, or they have to live in small, damp bedrooms. Crystal, what's your take on this idea about national service?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with you. What we're seeing here is just another example of the flailing Tories just throwing policies at the wall and seeing what sticks, what grabs headlines, and where they can get some traction. It's so clear from everything that we've seen and the reactions that we've seen that they didn't give this any thought at all. It seemed like someone had the idea one night and went out with it the next morning. And only 2 days ago we had the former the current defense minister saying that, ruling it out entirely, and saying that it would damage morale to have national service. So they have no idea where they're going with this, and it's honestly so laughable. It's truly ridiculous to watch, and I'm kind of enjoying it, to be honest with you. James cleverly says it's an appeal to address the coarseness in society and to create more social cohesion. And as you've rightly said, that they're not actually interested in that at all. If they were, they would be investing in social services, in education, putting money into deprived communities. This is, as you said, just an opportunity to win some points with older voters who think this is a brilliant idea for a bygone nationalism. And it's not gonna do anything. And even as soon as James Cleverly is pressed on it, it becomes clear that the headline of national military service, there isn't anything under that hood, and it's a much broader proposition. And I think it's also just a shame to just see the Tories attempting to demonize young people again. For all of the ills in society, when actually what we're seeing right now is the most politically engaged young people I've ever experienced. And I think it's so inspiring. And these are people who are fighting for social cohesion. It just happens to be a vision of society that the Tories don't agree with. And I think that's why we're seeing these kinds of reactionary policies. One thing I would say is, it's kind of nice to see them doing something. At least they've got a policy. It's kind of nice. It's nice to see one of the political parties actually offering something on the table. And as you said, Michael, I'm not actually that necessarily that opposed to the idea of civic duty and some national service. I think there could be some really interesting ways of looking at that. We could. I wouldn't be putting it towards the military, and I'm obviously deeply skeptical of the military, but there are ways I can imagine getting young people involved, or people of all ages. Why don't we, do some mandatory volunteering for people of all ages to get out and work in our national parks, or help that epidemic of loneliness amongst the elderly? There's lots of things that we could all be doing, and I'm not necessarily opposed to that idea. To be honest, it sounds kind of communist, and I say sign me up. But what we're seeing here is just real Tory nonsense, and it falls apart the second you poke it.
You really need to give people something in return. I think that point, as there was a really good, it was a thread that went viral actually, sort of saying in Denmark, because the reason why people sort of put Denmark forward as a possibility is because they have this system whereby they need to get, I think it's sort of 5,000 people every year to sign up for national service. And if they meet the 5,000, then no one gets sort of conscripted because they've already met the target through volunteers. And it's only if they don't get to the 5,000 that they have to conscript some people to sort of get to that 5,000 figure. And it is the case that normally they get 4,000 or so people volunteering. People saying, well, this means that people really want to do it. But you do get so much more back if you're a Danish teenager than if you're a British teenager. So that is why I think this does seem fairly punitive. And I think probably that's what the Tory strategists were thinking. This is not a pitch for 18-year-old voters. In terms of other policies, it was interesting because Labour on the weekend announced that they would reduce the voting age to 16, which I'm in favour of. But I do think, potentially controversial. You can call them gerrymanderers, right? And I would have expected the Tories to go hard on that, but instead they dramatically shifted the entire news agenda to this policy, which seems like it was sort of just taken out of their ass. So it doesn't seem like particularly good strategy to me. And it does seem pretty clear this whole policy was completely thought up on the back of an envelope. So much so that Tory party discipline is completely breaking down. The Northern Ireland Minister, Steve Baker, has sort of said that this was completely a surprise to Tory candidates. Of course, he's a government minister, and he penned a response to the national service policy. It's titled, "Where I Stand for Liberty Under the Rule of Law, Now, Always." In it, he writes this: "Before any more policy is announced, I want to be absolutely clear where I stand for the electors of Wickham. I am for liberty under the rule of law and parliamentary democracy. History has proven time and time again that liberty under law, not compulsion and planning, is the surest road to peace and prosperity. That is, when people are doing no harm, government should leave them to work through their own virtues and vices in voluntary associations with other people. So sort of this is the classical liberal case against what the Conservatives have announced. Lots of people have noted that he is Minister for Northern Ireland, which is a fairly sort of relevant role if you're talking about introducing something like national service. He was blindsided by it, and he's happy to go public with his opposition, which is not really what you want in the middle of a general election campaign. We'll be coming back to the general election at the end of our show. We should mention, though, Ash's weekly newsletter, the Cortado, because for the general election period, the Cortado will be going out 3 times a week. It usually goes out on a Friday. Now it's going to be out 3 times a week. If you want a morning dose of analysis from Ash and other Novara colleagues 3 times a week, then sign up at the link in the description below to sign up to that mail out. All the best news, always written in a very witty tone. I do enjoy it. I'm sure you will too. Arya Nair is an 87-year-old Jew who fled Nazi Germany before going on to co-found Human Rights Watch. Nair said he initially disagreed with the idea Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, so he believed they had a right to defend themselves after October the 7th, but he's appeared on CNN to explain why he's now changed his mind.
What changed my mind was that over a period of time, Israel has obstructed the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. And those who have been most severely victimized are not the members of Hamas. Men with guns ordinarily find a way to get food and to get fed. But it is young children who are most severely damaged by malnutrition and who will either starve to death, or if they survive, they will be diminished for the rest of their lives, diminished physically and psychologically by the severe malnutrition they are enduring as children. And I thought that severe obstruction of the delivery of humanitarian assistance amounted to genocide.
It's a really powerful intervention. So sort of Nair was clear, and I don't necessarily agree with him here, but he was saying when the ICJ first sort of put forward their case, their claim, that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza, he disagreed, right? He said because of the October the 7th attack, they do have a right to try and, essentially diminish the capacity of Hamas, and therefore, even if many civilians are getting killed, sort of this bombing campaign isn't genocide as such. And it is the starving of people in the Gaza Strip that has changed his mind. This seeing of children being refused the opportunity to eat, which will affect them throughout their whole life if they don't die in the here and now, right? He said that makes this a genocide. As I say, this is a really, really sort of significant person in the world of human rights, co-founder of Human Rights Watch, so one of the most sort of prestigious human rights organizations in the world. This is what he said next.
The amount of food and the amount of water and the amount of fuel they have allowed in is entirely inadequate to deal with the more than 2 million people who live in Gaza. And the USAID administrator, Samantha Power, testified before Congress that famine had set in Gaza. The head of the UN World Food Program has said that full-blown famine is underway in Gaza. Destroying the farms, destroying the greenhouses in Gaza, killing a large number of aid workers who were involved in the distribution of food, challenging the ability of the UN agency that has been principally involved in distributing food to continue that activity, and persuading the United States and other governments to cut off funds from that agency. All those things have had a cumulative impact on the availability of food and water and electricity and medical supplies in Gaza.
Just putting forward such overwhelming evidence, right? And I suppose this is what we're seeing more and more now. And, it's not a surprise. We've been seeing sort of this horrific war go on for months and months and months. But it's really mainstream figures coming out and citing really mainstream people and saying it's undeniable now. What's going on is genocide, or he's saying this is a genocide. So sort of quoting politicians, all of these UN agencies. You've got basically every humanitarian organization in the world saying that Israel is causing a famine in Gaza. And then you still have, Israeli spokespeople, Israeli talking heads getting about 50% of coverage, if not more, sort of in the Western press. You've got every single human rights organization, every single humanitarian organization in the world, every agency of the UN. And then the Americans kind of disagree and the Israelis absolutely disagree. So 50% of the time we hear, are they really starving people? It's like, who do you trust? Do you trust all these people who founded these human rights organizations and all these UN agencies? Or do you trust the country carrying out the war and their main sponsor? Arya Naya also talked about the far-right Israelis trying to sabotage food deliveries to Gaza.
At this moment, there are settlers in the West Bank area who are interrupting trucks, taking humanitarian assistance into to Gaza. They are attacking the truck driver, spilling the contents of trucks carrying humanitarian aid. The Israeli defense forces have not intervened in order to prevent the settlers from engaging in sabotage of that sort in delivering humanitarian assistance. The Israeli defense forces have aided the settlers, and a very large number of Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed in the past few months, often with the Israel defense forces either standing by or directly participating in attacks on Palestinians in that area.
So talking about the West Bank in this situation, I think is so important. I mean, you might saw, obviously I didn't speak as powerfully as this gentleman, but I was speaking on Piers Morgan about this. And Hen Mazik, who's this Israeli influencer, when I brought up the West Bank, he was saying, don't talk about the West Bank. Don't talk about the West Bank. We're talking about Gaza. And the reason he said it is because Israeli spokespeople, Israeli sort of outriders, talking heads, they want this all to be about Israel versus Hamas. Israel versus Hamas. They don't want you to talk about Palestine. They don't want you to talk about the Palestinians. They want you to talk about Israel, Hamas. And then if you mention the expansion of settlements, the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, say, no, that's a different issue. That's a different issue. So it's important for sort of these establishment figures to be constantly bringing this up. Naya was also asked what he thought of Netanyahu accusing the chief prosecutor at the ICC of anti-Semitism.
The use of the term anti-Semitism to attack those who criticize Israeli policies degrades the concept of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has been a great scourge, but it doesn't insulate the Israeli government from being held to the same standards that other governments have to be held to around the world. The Israeli government has been very comfortable with certain anti-Semites. Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, has cultivated a relationship with Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and I think it's appropriate to consider Orban an anti-Semite. But to charge the International Criminal Court with anti-Semitism is, I think, absurd.
For you, as somebody, a Jew who escaped Nazi Germany, it's a weighty charge to accuse Israel of genocide.
It's a terrible thing to accuse anyone of genocide, but it's a more terrible thing that genocide should take place. In my view, Jews are only going to be safe if everyone's rights are respected, and the rights of Jews are respected along with the rights of everyone else.
Jews will only be safe if everyone else has rights. Really, really inspirational guy, really, really powerful speaker. I mean, I'm really glad that that kind of interview went out on CNN. And I suppose it just shows how out of step with, I think, basic humanity so many of the people who are still willing to cheerlead for Israel are, right? You've got someone who fled the Nazis as a child, co-founded Human Rights Watch, saying what's going on is genocide. You still have people sort of scoff if you say that Israel might be committing genocide in Gaza. Say, oh, how ridiculous! Oh, you're just a radical leftist. I mean, you can't really have more authority when you speak than this guy here, right? 87 years old. And, I just really hope, well, I tried to say I hope the world listens, because the world knows, don't they? I hope that the United States, the UK, are forced into taking some kind of action to stop this genocide continuing. After the first weekend of the general election, it's already clear this could be the most embarrassing campaign by a government in history. Now, I'm sure you remember the election campaign was launched with a speech in the pouring rain. Things can only get better, blasted in the background, but things didn't get better. Just after that election announcement, Sunak visited a brewery in Wales where this totally normal conversation took place.
So you're looking forward to all the football?
Not so much my bag. But,
well,
get
people in.
No, but that's because you guys aren't in it.
Well, to get people out, there'll be people coming. It'll be good summer of sport.
England, at least.
I'm not sure if Rishi Sunak knew before he asked that question that Wales hadn't qualified for the Euros, but in any case, it came across as a somewhat awkward exchange. It got more awkward, though, because on Friday, Sunak visited the Titanic district in Belfast, making the lives of journalists just a little bit too easy.
Prime Minister, we are just yards away from where the Titanic was built and designed. Are you captaining a sinking ship going into this election?
So if you look at what's happened over the past few weeks alone, you can see that our plan is working.
You could have chosen anywhere. Who chose the Titanic district to take a sinking party? Completely bizarre. Later that day, they're supposed to be the most successful party in the Western world, is what people often say about the Conservatives. And we often think it's because they're brutal, cutthroat, professional. They're taking a sinking prime minister to the Titanic or the Titanic district. Later that day, so an image of the Prime Minister on the campaign trail was released. It shows Sunak on his campaign jet standing underneath an exit sign. Plenty of Tories haven't needed an exit sign to see the writings on the wall, though, leaving politics as quickly as possible. Now, a total of 79 Tory MPs have said they won't bother contesting their seats. That's the largest number to quit before a general election since the Second World War. One of the quitters who took Sunak by surprise was Michael Gove. He announced his retirement on Friday night. Just 2 days earlier, the Financial Times had reported this. When Rishi Sunak told his cabinet after weeks of agonising that he would hold a surprise July 4th general election, he immediately won the effusive support of his housing minister, Michael Gove. "Who dares wins," Gove said on Wednesday afternoon, quoting the SAS regiment's motto, "You dared and you will win." Actions, of course, speak louder than words, and Gove's actions suggest those words might have been just a little bit sarcastic. What's just as worrying for Sunak is this: those MPs who are daring enough to stay and fight for their seats don't seem to be trying particularly hard. The Times report a leaked email from CCHQ has put the blame for Sunak's campaign misfortunes on Conservative MPs themselves. The email was apparently sent by mistake and includes a file containing the unvarnished thoughts of Conservative staff on Tory MPs' attitudes to the election. Here's what the Times writes. In Plymouth Moorview, the seat of Johnny Mercer, the Veterans Minister, staff said there was an issue with MP cooperation with CCHQ and funding issues, currently 2K in the bank, and they'd offered support. The Times reported last week that Mercer had written a memo over his frustration with Rishi Sunak's domination of campaigning. So he's saying, "I don't want Rishi Sunak out there talking to people. That is not a recipe for me keeping my seat." Times also report Rebecca Powell, the Nature Minister, I didn't know there was one, was accused by campaigning staff of spending too much time on ministerial business. Under the heading for her Taunton and Wellington seat, the memo read, "MP still focusing too much on ministerial business and non-committal on time she will spend in the seat now and during the campaign." So they're saying, can you promise that you will be knocking on doors on these days? She's saying, maybe. I've got other work to do. Does she want to get re-elected? Not clear. Again, they didn't want this to be public. They sent this email out by mistake with all of these details. And finally, Sarah Atherton, the MP for Wrexham, was accused of refusing to engage in the note, which said, quote, "wants to cancel this week's campaigning sessions and stop campaign manager from running pre-scheduled campaigning sessions over the weekend." So not only does she not want to take part, she doesn't want anyone else to take part either. Other Tory MPs seem to have better things to do than campaign at all. Cheadle's Mary Robinson is reported to be on a 7-day holiday, as is Government Minister Steve Baker. Now, this is good. He told the Mirror this: "The Prime Minister told everyone we could go on holiday and then called a snap election. So I've chosen to do my campaign work in Greece." He is a minister. This is not just any old MP. He's saying, I'm going to do my campaign work from the beach in Greece because I'm a bit annoyed that he called this election anyway. Of course, you probably can't blame MPs for putting their feet up. And those MPs who are making the effort aren't doing so well. Minister for London, Greg Hands, sends his child to the independent St Paul's School, very prestigious school. He's posted in a parents' group chat suggesting that St Paul's, like another private school, should send out a letter warning parents of Labour's plans to remove VAT exempt status from independent schools. Now, he posted an image of the letter from Ride boarding school in the group, and he captioned it, "Has anyone seen St. Paul's do a letter like this?" Now, you might expect that call for intra-class solidarity would go down well among the well-to-do parents of St. Paul's students. But Greg Hands got a different response. One replied with this, "Can we stop assuming everyone is a Tory in this group? A return to some more morality, less corruption and more social conscience in British politics is not something to oppose necessarily. I appreciate this will be widely derided as a comment, but I do think this group needs some balance." Now, that wasn't necessarily widely derided because it got 8 thumbs up in this group of very, very posh parents. Another parent said, "Could this migrate to another chat? There will be people on this chat who, despite the very real extra financial burden VAT would bring, still feel it is hard to defend private schools being VAT exempt, just as there will be those who think the opposite. It is a political discussion, and as such, this doesn't feel the place for it." So we already know the Tories have lost the votes of the majority of people under 70, I think it's the majority of people under 70. Every age group under 70 is voting for Labour. They've now lost private school parents, the parents of people who send their kids to St. Paul's. This is a sort of SOS, red flashing lights warning for the Conservatives. If you've lost the kids at one of Britain's poshest private schools, you're going to be in trouble. Those screenshots, of course, were then leaked to the Times, so adding insult to injury. Meanwhile, sitting Tory MP for Telford, Lucy Allen, who isn't seeking re-election, has decided to go out with a bang, declaring this: "I'm supporting Alan Adams to be Telford's next MP. If you want to help Alan or donate to his campaign, sign up to this website." Now, Alan Adams, as you can see from that image, is not the Tory candidate. He is a candidate for Reform UK. Lucy Allen has been suspended from the Conservative Party. Even Sunak's strongest cheerleaders are also sounding rather desperate. So the Daily Mail this morning bragged, "Rishi Sunak fights back after his national service plan is ridiculed." Right? So when Prime Minister fights back after universal ridicule is the best headline you can hope for, you really are screwed. Crystal, it's been fairly enjoyable, hasn't it, the general election campaign so far?
I'm so delighted to be here and to just add to that ridicule, I moved here in 2009 and had 6 months of Gordon Brown before 14 years of Tories. So permit me this election cycle, just a lot of schadenfreude. It's delightful to watch the shambles with every defection, with every resignation, with every leak and reveal. I honestly, there isn't enough popcorn in the world for me right now. I'm having a great time watching it. I mean, truly, that parents' WhatsApp group is it's so delicious. When that's when all you've got for your campaign is WhatsApp groups, I feel bad for that man. So yes, obviously I'm having a lovely time watching it all. I'm so glad that we're not going to have to hear from Michael Gove anymore. What a treat for me. But obviously it is also tinged with a bit of sadness because, I don't feel like my other options are significantly better right now. I feel sad about what could have been. I feel sad for the Labour Party that once was. And it's hard knowing that, we're trading in one bunch for what feels right now like a diet version of the Tories. And I wanted more than that. I wanted better options. And that part's really hard. Labour currently giving us nothing to be excited about. Their media appearances, they're refusing to commit to anything right now. And everything that they have said in the last few months has been very disappointing. Their stance on Gaza, rolling back their commitments on nationalizing our industries. It's all very, very disappointing. And I know it's not going to be a surprise to anyone listening to hear me say that, but I hope something happens soon to get me a bit excited.
I'm not sure we're the target vote. Maybe Labour will sort of pull something out of the hat to try and get us infused, but they seem to be sort of interested in another sort of segment of voters. I do like their sort of the tone in that group chat, which is, we might be posh, but we're not all evil, sort of as St. Paul's parents. Crystal, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been great.
And thank you everyone for watching. Come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.